Hello cinema comrades. I know that I promised to take a break from Hong Kong films in order to focus more time on other cinemas from East Asia, but let this be a lesson to you all. I break promises. It's just something I do. So never love me, you'll only get hurt. As the title asserts, the video will be dedicated to 3 Hong Kong films that I think are way too underrated. A lot of you might think that by underrated, I'm going to be referring to Hong Kong films that are incredibly difficult for the average person to see, or there isn't subtitled versions of them available outside of academia, making this whole video a narcissistic exercise in cinematic gatekeeping and contrarianism. And I'm not going to lie, it's true. I have an unhealthily large ego, and like many contrarians, by going against the grain, I hope to distract people from the fact that I lack a personality. But there's another reason why I'm making this video that's a little less based on my approval complex. The way I see it, if these films are spoken about more and a demand is generated for them, then maybe distributors and archives will be more willing to make them available. We can only hope. Now, I just need to make this point before I start my list. None of these films are going to be either martial arts or heroic bloodshed pictures. This is due to these genres being well represented on YouTube already, and pretty much dominate Hong Kong international film distribution, so I think it's a little more interesting to highlight different types of films that don't usually get as much attention. And it makes my job way easier too. There are far too many overlooked martial arts films from Hong Kong, and as I've made clear in previous videos, I'm very lazy. This also applies to Shaw Brothers non-martial arts films. There are tons of overlooked melodramas and horrors that hardly get any recognition, so they will likely require their own dedicated videos. However, I will add Song of Tomorrow as a quick honourable mention. It's probably my favourite Shaw Brothers film, being one of the studio's best attempts at non-period drama, and deals with issues relevant to then contemporary Hong Kong. It was also directed by arguably Shaw Brothers' most underappreciated director, To Chun, or Do Ching. This guy was super committed to the Shaw family business as well. His directing credits for them go all the way back to the early 50s, when the company was still Shaw and Sons. Now that's dedication. So make sure you find yourself a lover who's as committed to you as Ching was to the Shaws. Don't just have high standards, people. Have Ching standards. You deserve it. Anyway, oh, by the way, I will be overusing the word anyway in this video, so feel free to make a drinking game out of it. Enjoy yourselves. Anyway, I've worked very hard to keep this list at only 3 films, as I believe that these formats should be adhered to strictly out of respect for the expectations of those people who are kind enough to click on the video. Few things frustrate me more than clickbait. So, here are 3 individual Hong Kong films that I believe are underrated. The Torrent Trilogy. Okay, I lied, this is 3 films, but in my defence, I did tell you not to trust me. Not only are these 3 films beautiful takes on changing family dynamics, where modernity comes into conflict with feudal traditions, but each film was directed by absolute masters of Hong Kong cinema, especially the last 2 films, which for me are the strongest, that were directed by 2 of my personal favourites. And can we just take a second to appreciate how damn sexy they both were? I mean, come on. The films are usually referred to as Cantonese melodramas, a term I'll come back to later, and after the war, due to the close relationship between cinema and radio in Hong Kong, a lot of them were adapted from radio plays. But the Torrent Trilogy films, however, are adaptations of a hugely influential and semi-autobiographical literary series written by Jin, and focuses on the intergenerational struggles of an upper-class family during the 1920s. This was a period of time when China was generally moving away from its so-called feudalistic ways, specifically coming into conflict with values that were essentially relics from the May 4th movement. For those who aren't familiar, the May 4th movement was named after a student demonstration at Tiananmen Square in Beijing. No, not that one. This one was held in 1919 on, I forget the specific day, but it was in protest to the Allied forces' decision after World War I to give the then German-occupied Shandong to Japan instead of China, which, as you can imagine, that would cause a bit of a stir. However, the movement itself is associated more with an intellectual and cultural demand to modernise and save the Chinese nation from various internal failures and the horrific abuse from foreign imperialism. The principles manifested from the movement were kind of reformist, and at the risk of being reductive, they aimed to challenge old traditions in favour of more Western, or more specifically, Enlightenment values, like democracy and science, though there is way more to it than that, to be fair. But despite being an unfinished project in mainland China, the legacy of it shaped China's leftist film movement and subsequently seeped into the new cultural elites in Hong Kong during the Cold War. So much so that scholars like Chang argued that the left-leaning Cantonese film companies in Hong Kong during the 1950s became torchbearers for the pre-war May 4th reformist ideals, where they used Cantonese films to adapt these ideals to Hong Kong's colonial context and educate their audiences with a type of hybrid version of Chinese nationalism that freed them from committing to either the KMT's or Communist Party's competing ideas of national identity, which were massively dividing Hong Kongers at the time. There were some pretty intense riots in the 1950s between Hong Kong residents supporting the KMT and the others who endorsed the communists. So, by projecting an idea of national identity that neither endorsed the KMT or the Chinese Communist Party, the films were able to resonate with a broader group of people. These Cantonese filmmakers essentially adapted a leftist understanding of the May 4th principles, related to things like anti-feudalism and gender equality, and localised them for 1950s Hong Kong's unique colonial and Cold War situation. This arguably made them, at least for the time, the closest to a true local Hong Kong cinema. These leftist companies would also trigger a golden age of progressive Cantonese films in the 1950s, and the Torrent Trilogy being one of its greatest contributions, especially when you consider the company that produced them, the Union Film Enterprises. Union functioned as a cooperative, made up of around 21 artists in Hong Kong to improve the quality of Cantonese cinema, as at the time it was known for what the cultural elites referred to as producing backwards and low art pictures, these often being operas, martial arts and ghost films. But with their brand of sophisticated and socially conscious melodramas, Union avoided the escapist trends within Cantonese cinema during the time, attempting to depict more naturalistic portraits of everyday life and educate their audiences in Hong Kong and beyond. Union made many great films, and many of them are still underappreciated enough to probably have made this list, but I really want to push the Torrent Trilogy. Not only does it give me an excuse to add 3 films instead of 1, and believe me, I'm going to milk that, but the first film, Family, was actually the first film produced by Union as a whole. Well, I think it was a co-production with Grand View, but still, it was a landmark production for them. According to Law Ga, these then modern Cantonese melodramas developed along 2 lines, exploring the ethics and relationship dynamics of a contemporary family, or a romance. And for those eagle-eyed viewers out there, you've probably already figured out that this trilogy primarily focuses on the former. The fact that the first film is called Family pretty much gives that away. But romance is explored too, especially amongst the younger characters. But if you're familiar with a lot of the writings on Cantonese melodramas from the 50s, you'll know that the word melodrama is pretty contentious, and rightly so, as I think it prevents a lot of people, especially those who are more familiar with Hollywood's conceptualization of melodrama, from properly appreciating them. This is a huge subject, so you'll have to forgive me for any oversimplifications. I'll add some links to better sources in the description. But the films in this trilogy, and Union's output in general, were referred to as Wenyi, or specifically Wenyi Pian. Wen referring to literature, Yi referring to art, and Pian, film. Wenyi Pian has historically been over-equated with Western-style melodrama films, which resulted in many people from the West viewing them with Hollywood expectations and, as you can probably guess, often rejecting them as subpar. The problem being, although translating Wenyi with Melodrama is convenient, it prevents the films from being properly appreciated for both what they intended to achieve and what they actually achieved. On the other hand, its association with the West is actually quite complicated, as in the late imperial and republican periods of China, Wenyi was used to reference works translated from foreign, particularly Western, literature. But by the 20s and 30s, it evolved in a way where it began to refer to literature that attempted to modernise China, which subsequently influenced Chinese filmmakers to use their medium to serve this national progress agenda too. So, as Chang puts it, Wenyi evolved from faithful translations of Western works to deliberately unfaithful ones in order to incorporate a hybrid of translingual and intercultural elements to serve a complicated, and frankly convoluted, national modernisation goal. But this brings me to another aspect that needs to be considered when watching these films. Although these Hong Kong Wenyi or melodrama films from the 50s and 60s were influenced heavily by the May 4th literature and art, they were also influenced by Cantonese opera. Cantonese opera traditions intentionally incorporate moralistic and didactic components that are almost necessary parts of its form, which often results in them being seen as preachy and academic. And as Cantonese melodramas adopted a lot of these characteristics, they were also burdened with these criticisms, which is totally unfair, because the preachy finger-waving didacticism in Cantonese melodrama shouldn't really be seen as a clumsy or erroneous dramatic device, at least not in the same way we would with Western melodramas, as it was used intentionally by the filmmakers in accordance with characteristics associated with the traditional palette of the Cantonese opera. Personally, I think criticising Cantonese melodramas for being didactic is like accusing Ozu of being slow, Monet's paintings of being blurry, or a haiku poem for being short. It's a feature, not a bug. Sometimes films from particular genres need to be judged according to their own rules and traditions for us to truly appreciate what they can offer. Anyway, the film Family's success marked the true beginning of Hong Kong's Cantonese cinema golden age. The film beautifully uses the ancestral home of the family to criticise the stagnation of traditional Chinese domestic values and the fight for individual freedom, whilst at the same time negotiating all of this with a desire to save the Chinese family. Chang frames this really well by equating the family home to having a prison-like influence of the old family system on the freedoms and psyche of the younger generation. Aside from the drama and historical significance, I really think these films are beautifully shot too. I've noticed that a lot of people reduce these left-wing Cantonese films to kind of an overspill of the leftist films from Shanghai in the 30s and 40s. But not only is this wrong because it's crudely reductionist, but I'd argue that they, the Torrent Trilogy films in particular, surpass most of them, both in their drama and aesthetics. Especially the use of shadows, silhouettes and frames within frames, which Chang points out suggests a type of darkness that contrasts with the younger characters' hopes of individualism, constantly trying to merge them into the house and rob them of their identities outside of the family. These really need to be seen by more people. Well, if I'm honest, most of the 1950s Cantonese melodramas do. They still seem to be only appreciated by older Cantonese people and academics. This is mostly due to the lack of availability of subtitled versions of these films, and the fact that too many Hong Kong cinema fans still seem to think that Hong Kong cinema began in the late 60s and early 70s. Which is such a shame, as I guarantee films like those in the Torrent Trilogy, and from Union in general, would be loved by a good chunk of them. If so many of us can see the value in Category 3 exploitation films, and enjoy them within their own appropriate contexts, then there should be no issues in us doing the same with these gorgeous Cantonese dramas. And the next film on my list is Clara Law's Autumn Moon. The second, and for me, the best in what critics call Law's migration trilogy. Don't worry, I'm not going to add all 3 films to the list like I did with the Torrent Trilogy. I mean, I was initially going to do that, but then I thought it was probably pushing the format a bit too much. And if I'm honest, a lesser reason was I kind of got a bit lazy. Okay, it was the main reason. It was the only reason. I confess, these videos take so damn long to make. Anyway, Autumn Moon did get a DVD release, and it was pretty good to be fair, but it desperately needs an upgrade. Like the other 2 films in this alleged trilogy, Autumn Moon brilliantly depicts not only the complex migration patterns within Greater China, which is in and of itself a controversial concept, but also East Asia's Generation X, or what's sometimes hilariously coined GenerAsian X. See what they did there? If I've uncovered anything that's even remotely genius in this video, it's this wordplay pun right here. Amazing. Like the Generation X of the USA, because as you know, everything has to work around the standards of the USA, this approximately covered those younger people in the 1990s, born from around the mid-1960s to early 80s. And all 3 of Law's films focus a good chunk of their time on either the youth or young adults migrating around the world. They're often described as being allegorical transnational films, or addressing the subject of transnationalism and the diaspora experience through analogies. The films in this trilogy usually have characters who have travelled and characters who are about to travel. In Autumn Moon, the travelling character is Tokyo, a young man from Japan who is shown looking for what he calls authentic Cantonese food in Hong Kong. The character who is about to travel is Pui Wei, a teenage girl who's planning on leaving her life in Hong Kong to move to Canada, where her parents are already living. The 2 characters just so happen to encounter each other and develop a relationship. It sounds a bit creepy, I know, but for some reason, it just isn't. Possibly because it's a humorous sibling-like relationship that evolves because both of them seem to be just as lost as each other, only for different reasons. I understand that a lot of people would consider Autumn Moon to be a pretty obvious and superficial allegory. You know, the Japanese character leaves Japan to search for an authentic sense of Chineseness, and the local girl represents the essence of Hong Kong, acting as his spiritual tour guide, but the film gives us way more than that. There's a great scene when Tokyo asks the girl to take him to a place where he can eat authentic Hong Kong cuisine, and she takes him to a McDonald's. The punchline quality of the cut and its timing is hilarious. She says something about her having a birthday party at a McDonald's, so she feels personally that it's local and authentic for her. A pretty obvious play on the culture of consumers' identity that Hong Kong has developed a reputation for after the 1960s, where Hong Kong became known as a capitalist gateway between the West and the East. So notions of Chineseness, an already contentious topic, became even more complex due to Hong Kong's colonial context. However, despite the gag being low-hanging fruit, it's effective and sets up the characters' journeys really well, as they both go on to develop this genius rapport with the girl's grandmother, a relationship built around her cooking. This is where Tokyo begins to engage with what could be considered authentic Hong Kong cuisine, and the closest to what could be interpreted as authentic Chineseness. The 3 characters find this cool way of communicating with each other, a mix between broken English and written Chinese, as there are similarities between Chinese characters and Japanese kanji. All 3 of them find transnational intersections, which subsequently creates a common space for human connection. Eventually the 2 friends celebrate their bond via the Autumn Moon Festival, title drop, a Chinese festival dedicated to the autumn moon, harvest and family. The 2 discuss the similarities and differences between Autumn Moon and the Japanese festival, Obon, showing that the Japanese and Chinese have a common heritage, but at the same time, their conversation shows a common fragmentation and uncertain identity caused by globalization becoming more and more prominent. The grandmother, who eventually becomes hospitalized, is almost an embodiment of what the girl and her parents leave behind when they move away from Hong Kong, especially as the then British colony is handed to China. The grandmother is loved in the same way China is loved, as an abstract idea of a homeland, but she needs to be left behind, as she won't survive in the modern, or should I say postmodern, world of the diaspora. which, whether right or wrong, was a common feeling many, though not all, Hong Kongers had at the time. The film also uses these beautiful long static shots, and it's nice to see Hong Kong in the 90s filmed in such a relaxed and lingering way. Most of the films at the time were fast paced and didn't really give us enough time to truly take in Hong Kong as a space. Sure, you could argue that Wong Kar-wai did this to a degree, but it was always overly romanticised, more like an emotive dream or neon trip. Clara Law has a more sober approach, which, despite having surreal elements to it, feels more grounded in real life, well, whatever that means. And the final film in my list, if you still trust me enough to believe that it's my final film that is Lau Xing-hon's sexy little masterpiece, House of the Lute. When it comes to this one, it tends to be reduced to an erotic film with cheeky satirical undertones, which surprises me because it's blatantly the other way around. In fact, I'd argue that it's one of Hong Kong cinema's best attempts at satire. I know that's a huge statement, but it's true, and quite obvious, which surprises me further that it gets so overlooked, especially considering that it was released during the early period of what's known as the Hong Kong New Wave. The story is deceptively simple, concerning itself with an old and rich musician who specialises in the pipa, commonly referred to in the West as the Chinese lute. The elderly man hires a young and strapping working class man to be the gardener for his mansion, but, in true pornographic fashion, the old man is also married to an incredibly attractive and much younger woman who takes a liking to this new gardener. The situation isn't helped by the fact the old man is bound to a wheelchair and clearly suffers from impotence, leaving his wife, who is still very much in her sexual awakening, to endure relentless sexual frustration. Okay, judging by the plot alone, the film is, at best, a third-rate lonely housewife erotica, and at worst, hot wife porn. But, like the other films in this list, there's way more going on here, and the characters are not actually as superficial as their actions might suggest. The gardener is a relatively good person, or maybe innocent is the right word, and the wife isn't really a gold digger. In fact, her husband's music is really what attracted her to him, more than his money. The deterioration of the character's moral stability is more to do with how the film functions as a fable about the dangers of materialism, and at the same time, a type of metaphor for Hong Kong's problematic, though incredibly unique, class system. Given Hong Kong's long and frankly inconsistent history of censorship, partly resulting in its cinema developing a reputation for being apolitical, or what Tom Cunliffe phrased, politically neutered, which I think is more accurate, I believe House of the Lute addresses these issues in ways earlier Hong Kong films couldn't, and if I'm honest, I think very few films have addressed them as effectively since. Regarding the materialism and consumerism commentary, you need to consider a bit of history to fully appreciate it, and as this is a history-based channel, I'm about to indulge in that right now. Although Hong Kong's industrialisation properly began in the 1950s, it would be the 1960s and 70s that saw a major era of transition regarding its society and culture. A guy called Matthew Turner argued that in the 1960s specifically, marked an era where consumer culture began to play a major part in defining the development of Hong Kong's identity, and was a type of coming of age for the people where they became a culture of lifestyle. Hong Kong's post-World War II economic boom was heavily romanticised and mythologised by the local media and popular collective imagination, and according to Man Fong Yip, triggered and interacted with an array of paralleling social phenomena, urbanisation being a significant example, as it was closely linked with Hong Kong's industrialisation and growing population, both being catalysts for a flourishing mass culture of consumers who were immersed within new architecture, entertainment and leisure options, consisting of things like pulp fiction, radio, dance halls, shopping centres, department stores, and by 1967, free-to-air commercial television. This all led to Hong Kong being seen as a materialist-driven society, and for a lot of Hong Kongers, this materialism was interpreted as corrupting family and moral values, a concern that I believe the film channels beautifully within its parable-like format. And before anyone accuses me of being overly speculative or interpreting the film from some kind of woke left-wing bias, the director, Lau Xing-han, has actually written about this in his own critical works, especially his interpretations of Cantonese cinema from the 50s and 60s, so take it up with him. A specific example of this is when the director compares how the family is represented in two films, the first being Parent's Heart and the second A Mad Woman, two films that could have made this list by the way. In the former, the poorer family is depicted as the centre of warmth and affection, but in the latter, the family, who are a large and materialistically wealthy one, are shown to be oppressive and spiteful. For Lau, Cantonese cinema subtly expressed concerns for the health of the family in the face of a more materialist-driven society. These anxieties are present in Lau's own film, however, the difference is, House of the Lute expresses criticism and subtle protest, whilst the older Cantonese films went more in the direction of stories that related to the struggle of the Hong Kong people, but ultimately the final message was to just learn to deal with it. Despite there being an anti-materialist attitude to this, they ultimately left a submissive aftertaste. An example of this that's been studied quite often is Kind Mother, Naughty Son, where a son who's been a very naughty boy leaves his mother and humble birthplace to become corrupted by the big city, inevitably resulting in a moral confusion and conflict with his mother. But eventually the naughty son stops being naughty and returns to his mom and their poor lifestyle. Lee Chuk-to frames the sentiments behind the film's conclusion as the son learning to live with poverty and his mother and find comfort in his social origin. This seems to be the consensus amongst Cantonese filmmakers of the 1950s, which was particularly problematic considering that most of the film's audience, at least locally anyway, were becoming more preoccupied with oppressive working conditions and a severe lack of social welfare support. So, the British colonial government would have benefited from people learning to live with and accept their poor situation, rather than actively trying to change it. House of the Lute, on the other hand, doesn't offer this submissive resolution, but expresses the idea that Hong Kong's materialist-obsessed culture can't just be accepted, as it eventually rots away at everything it touches. After the gardener begins his affair with the wife, he's introduced into her leisurely upper-class world and begins to enjoy the lifestyle and status. However, the longer he indulges in such privileges, the more obsessed he becomes with consumption and seeing everything around him as something to be materialistically owned. Even seeing the wife as a possession, at one point even trying to tattoo his name onto her as if she's now his property. The film is a parable, warning its viewers of the dangers of materialism that was changing Hong Kong society at the hand of rapid industrialisation and modernity. And unlike most of the Cantonese films from the 50s, acceptance and a stoic disposition is just not the answer, as it will eventually destroy all that is still meaningful. Another part of the film that's brilliantly executed, especially considering my affinity with history, is how it hints at the collaborative colonial concept. I've briefly mentioned this before in my other videos, but it refers to how we often view colonial Hong Kong as this binary existence between the powerful British and grassroots Chinese, but there was actually a third tier that existed in between. This was a small group of Chinese elites who were educated and encouraged by the British colonisers to act as mediators and help run the territory. Law Wing-sang coined this as collaborative colonialism. His book on the subject is essential reading. I might even pretend that it's a film just to add it to the list. I mean, come on, I've broken every other rule, so why not? So there we go. Collaborative colonialism. Written and directed by Law Wing-sang. Come on, Eureka or 88 Films. Make the box set happen. Collaborative obviously refers to how important this collaboration between the Europeans and Chinese elites were to facilitate the colonial power channels, which often resulted in these elites being seen as traitors and oppressive agents. Despite being ethnically Chinese and in a relative position of power, they were futile in helping the average grassroots Hong Konger who was struggling within the system these elites benefited from. The old man echoes the impotency of the Chinese elites and how they were powerless to serve the needs of the Hong Kong people, simply being conduits for the colonial powers. Despite being somewhat an anchor to traditionalism with his mastery of the peeper, for the wife, like the Hong Kong people in general, this visceral affinity with old China was no longer enough. For me, the film's parable-like approach captures these sentiments brilliantly. It actually works as pretty good erotica too, but unfortunately I can't show you much as YouTube has subtly accused me of being a pervert and gave me this warning. My Pink Film series years back got me this reputation, so I have to be careful with sex-related content, as the YouTube censorship team will punish me, and I've developed a bit of a taste for it. So there we go, kind of 3 underrated Hong Kong films. I probably should have done 10. In fact, when I originally put this video together, it was meant to be 10 films, but oh my god, so much work. Which is totally hypocritical as I ended up mentioning way more than 3 anyway. But depending on how this one is received, I'll probably do a part 2. Oh, screw it, I'll quickly mention 2 more. And I should probably focus on some more contemporary ones, especially considering this dogma that Hong Kong cinema is dead, you know, which circulates everywhere apart from Hong Kong, funnily enough, but that's a total myth. I'll add Drifting and Memories to Choke On and Drinks to Wash Them Down, as they are both, for me, masterpieces and proof of great modern independent filmmaking in Hong Kong. I'll probably do a video on both of them. But until then, let everyone know what Hong Kong films you think are underrated in the comments below. You could even mock my choices if you want. Be super mean. I love it. Like, to a point where it might even be inappropriate, actually. But anyway, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll be a bit more active in the future. But probably not. Have a good new year.